The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 18 years. Maria rolled over and hit the snooze button with the practiced motion of someone who had done this dance thousands of times before. 5 more minutes. That's all she needed. Just 5 more minutes to pretend she was a regular mom who didn't have to choose between paying rent and buying new shoes for her growing son. The small apartment was quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator that had been making that same noise since they moved in when David was 3 years old. Back then, she thought this place would be temporary. Just until she got back on her feet after the divorce. Just until she finished nursing school. Just until things got easier. But 18 years later, the same cracked ceiling stared back at her every morning, and the same water stain in the corner reminded her that some things never change no matter how hard you work. Maria finally dragged herself out of bed and walked to the kitchen. The coffee maker was already set up from the night before because she had learned long ago that morning Maria was not as organized as Midnight Maria. She pressed the button and listened to the familiar gurgling sound that meant caffeine was coming. Outside her window, the city was still dark, but she could see the early commuters already heading to work. Most people complained about early mornings, but Maria had grown to love this quiet time before the world woke up. She opened the refrigerator and stared at its contents. Half a carton of milk, some leftover Chinese food from 3 days ago, and a package of lunch meat that was probably still good. David would need lunch money again today. She made a mental note to stop by the ATM on her way to work, even though she knew exactly how much was in her account. Every dollar was accounted for, every penny had a purpose. The shower was quick and efficient. She had mastered the art of getting ready in 15 minutes, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. The hot water felt good on her shoulders, washing away the tension from yesterday's 12-hour shift. 3 surgeries, 2 cardiac arrests, and 1 family that screamed at her because their loved one had to wait an extra hour for pain medication. Just another Tuesday at the Naval Medical Center. Her uniform hung on the back of the bathroom door, freshly washed and pressed. The navy blue scrubs had seen better days, but they were clean and professional. She had learned to remove every stain, mend every small tear, and make old clothes look presentable. When you're a single mom working in a hospital, you become an expert at making things last longer than they're supposed to. Maria looked at herself in the mirror and practiced her smile. Not the fake customer service smile that hurt your cheeks after 8 hours, but the genuine one that made scared patients feel safe. The one that convinced worried families that everything would be okay, even when she wasn't sure it would be. Her reflection showed the face of a woman who had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders for so long that she forgot what it felt like to put it down. The drive to work was always the same route, past the same buildings, through the same traffic lights. But today felt different. Today, she kept thinking about the graduation ceremony that was exactly 2 weeks away. David had been talking about it for months, showing her the cap and gown, explaining where the ceremony would be held, asking if she would definitely be there. "Of course I'll be there," she had told him, but the words felt strange in her mouth. She had said those same words about soccer games, school plays, parent-teacher conferences, and science fairs. Sometimes she made it, but more often than not, the hospital needed her. Someone was always having a medical emergency at exactly the wrong time. The parking lot at the hospital was already filling up with the day shift workers. Maria recognized most of the cars by now. There was Dr. Johnson's fancy sedan that probably cost more than she made in 2 years. There was Linda from pediatrics with her minivan covered in soccer mom stickers. And there was her own 10-year-old Honda with the dent in the back bumper from when she backed into a fire hydrant during David's middle school graduation. Walking through the hospital corridors felt like coming home, even though home was supposed to be that small apartment with the leaky faucet. These halls had been her second home for 15 years. She knew which elevator was fastest, which vending machine had the best coffee, and which bathroom was always clean. She had spent more hours in this building than anywhere else, including her own bedroom. The trauma unit was already busy when she arrived. Night shift was finishing up their reports, and Maria could tell by their faces that it had been a long night. 3 car accidents, 1 shooting, and a heart attack victim who barely made it. She took report from Jessica, a younger nurse who still had that energy that comes from believing you can save everyone. Room 302 is asking for you specifically, Jessica said with a tired smile. He was here 6 months ago after that explosion overseas. Says you're the only nurse who understands his jokes. Maria remembered him immediately. Sergeant Williams, 24 years old, shrapnel wounds to his arms and chest, homesick for his girlfriend in Texas. She had spent her lunch breaks playing cards with him because he was scared and lonely. That's what she did. She took care of people, whether it was removing stitches or just listening to their fears about going back to combat. The morning flew by in a blur of medications, wound dressings, and comfort words. Room 315 needed extra pain medication. Room 307 was worried about his surgery next week. Room 312 just wanted someone to call his wife and let her know he was okay. Maria moved from room to room like a gentle tornado, fixing problems and easing worries with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this job longer than some of her patients had been alive. During her lunch break, she sat in the cafeteria and pulled out her phone. David had sent her a text message with a picture of his cap and gown hanging in his closet. 2 weeks, Mom. I can't wait for you to see me walk across that stage. She stared at that message for a long time. 2 weeks, 14 days. She had already put in her request for time off, the first personal day she had asked for in 8 months. Her supervisor had approved it with a surprised look, probably because Maria never asked for anything. She worked holidays so other nurses could be with their families. She stayed late when emergencies came in. She covered shifts when people called in sick, but this was different. This was David's graduation, and she had promised. She had missed too many important moments already. Too many times she had to choose between being there for her son and being there for patients who needed her. Tonight, she would go home and look at that old navy blue dress hanging in her closet. The one she wore to church and special occasions. She would make sure it was clean and pressed and perfect, because in 2 weeks she was going to watch her son graduate from high school. For the first time in months, Maria smiled a real smile, not the professional one she wore at work, but the one that came from deep inside her heart. In 2 weeks she was going to be just another proud mom in the audience, cheering for her child. Nothing else would matter that day. Nothing else would come first. The morning of graduation day arrived with the kind of sunshine that makes everything feel possible. Maria had barely slept the night before, not because she was nervous, but because she was excited. For the first time in months, she didn't have to set her alarm for 4:30 a.m. She could sleep in until 7, have a real breakfast, and take her time getting ready for the most important day of her son's life. She had spent the previous evening preparing everything perfectly. Her navy blue dress was pressed and hanging on the bedroom door. Her good shoes, the black flats she saved for special occasions, were polished and waiting by the closet. She had even bought a small corsage from the grocery store florist, something she could pin to her dress to make the day feel extra special. David had left early that morning with his classmates for their final rehearsal. Before walking out the door, he had hugged her tight and whispered, "Thanks for always being there, Mom. I know it wasn't easy." Those words had brought tears to her eyes because he understood. Somehow, her 18-year-old son knew exactly how much she had sacrificed to make this day possible. Maria took her time getting ready, something she hadn't done in years. She styled her hair carefully, applied a little makeup, and put on the dress that had served her well for church services and the few social events she could afford to attend. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who was proud, hopeful, and ready to celebrate her greatest achievement, raising a good son. The high school was in the wealthy part of town, about a 20-minute drive from their apartment. As Maria drove through the tree-lined streets with their perfectly manicured lawns and expensive cars in every driveway, she felt a familiar knot in her stomach. This wasn't her world. These weren't her people. But today, her son belonged here, just as much as anyone else, because he had earned his place through hard work and determination. The school parking lot was already filling up with families arriving for the ceremony. Maria watched through her windshield as parents climbed out of luxury SUVs and expensive sedans. The women wore designer dresses and carried purses that probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent. The men adjusted their expensive ties and checked their gold watches. Everyone looked like they belonged in a magazine. Maria took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't about comparing herself to other parents. This was about celebrating David's accomplishment. She grabbed her small purse, checked her invitation one more time, and headed toward the school entrance. The closer she got to the building, the more out of place she felt. Other families walked past her in groups, chatting about vacation plans and college preparations. She heard conversations about private tutoring, expensive test prep courses, and summer programs that cost thousands of dollars. These were the families who could afford to give their children every advantage, while Maria had given David something different, the knowledge that success comes from working hard and never giving up. The main entrance to the auditorium was decorated with balloons and banners congratulating the graduating class. 2 security guards stood at the doors, checking invitations and directing families to their seats. Maria had never seen security guards at a high school graduation before, but she figured it must be normal for schools in neighborhoods like this. She approached the entrance. One of the guards looked up from the clipboard he was holding. He was a tall man in his 40s with gray hair and a stern expression that suggested he took his job very seriously. The second guard was younger, maybe in his 30s, with the kind of build that came from spending too much time at the gym. "Good morning," Maria said politely, reaching into her purse for David's invitation. "I'm here for the graduation ceremony." The older guard looked her up and down slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance. Her dress, though clean and pressed, was clearly several years old. Her shoes, while polished, showed the wear of someone who spent long hours on her feet. Her purse was functional rather than fashionable, and her jewelry consisted of a simple, cross necklace that had been a gift from David on her last birthday. "Ma'am," the guard said in a tone that was supposed to sound professional but carried an unmistakable edge of judgment. "This is a private ceremony for family members only. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Maria felt her cheeks flush with confusion. "Yes, I'm sure. My son is graduating today. Here's his invitation." She held out the gold-embossed card that David had proudly given her 2 weeks earlier. The younger guard stepped closer, examining the invitation with more attention than seemed necessary. "This looks legitimate," he said to his partner, as if Maria might have somehow forged a high school graduation invitation. "But we still need to see some identification." Maria fumbled in her purse for her driver's license, her hands beginning to shake slightly. Around her, other parents were walking through the doors without any questions being asked. She watched a woman in an expensive fur coat breeze past the guards with nothing more than a smile and a wave. A man in a custom-tailored suit didn't even slow down as he entered the building. "Here's my ID," Maria said, handing over her license. The guards studied it for what felt like an eternity, comparing her address to some invisible standard in their minds. The older guard handed back her license but didn't step aside to let her pass. Instead, he exchanged a meaningful look with his partner. "Ma'am, I'm going to be honest with you. We're having some concerns about appropriateness today." "I'm sorry. What do you mean?" Maria asked, though she was beginning to understand exactly what he meant. "Well, this is a very special day for these families," the younger guard explained, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Maria's skin crawl. "These are successful people who have worked hard to give their children the best opportunities in life. We want to make sure the ceremony maintains a certain standard." Maria looked down at her dress, suddenly seeing it through their eyes. The hem that she had mended herself, the slight fading around the collar, the way it didn't quite fit the same way it had 5 years ago when she bought it. Then she looked at the other parents still streaming through the doors. The designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the confidence that came from never having to worry about whether you belonged somewhere. "I understand your concerns," the older guard continued, "but perhaps it would be better if you found somewhere else to watch the ceremony. Maybe from outside the building? I'm sure they'll have speakers set up so you can hear what's happening." The words hit Maria like a physical blow to her chest. She felt the blood drain from her face as the full weight of what was happening settled over her. They were asking her to leave. Not because she had done anything wrong. Not because she didn't. have an invitation, but because she didn't look like she belonged with the other parents. Behind her, she could hear more families arriving, their cheerful conversations and excited laughter creating a soundtrack to her humiliation. She clutched David's invitation tighter, the paper crinkling in her trembling hands. This was supposed to be the proudest day of her life, the moment when all her sacrifices and hard work paid off. Instead, she was standing at the door being told she wasn't good enough to watch her own son graduate. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's my son. I've worked 2 jobs for 18 years to make sure he could be here today. I've never missed a day of work to come to his school events, but I promised I'd be here for this." The guards looked unmoved by her plea. Other parents continued to walk past them into the building, some glancing curiously at the scene unfolding at the door. Maria felt their stares like spotlights, illuminating her shame for everyone to see. She wanted to disappear, to run back to her car and drive home to the safety of her small apartment, where no one could judge her for not being enough. Across the crowded lobby, 10 men in crisp navy dress uniforms stood quietly near the wall, watching the scene unfold at the entrance doors. They had arrived 15 minutes earlier for the graduation of their teammate's younger brother, a young man they had watched grow up through photos and video calls during long deployments overseas. Commander Rodriguez, the senior officer among them, had been the first to notice the woman at the door. Something about her posture caught his attention. The way she held herself with dignity despite the obvious discomfort of the situation, the careful way she had dressed for this special day, the trembling in her hands as she clutched what appeared to be a graduation invitation. "You see what's happening over there?" whispered Petty Officer Chen, nodding toward the entrance. His voice was barely audible, but in their line of work these men had learned to communicate without drawing attention to themselves. Rodriguez nodded slowly, his trained eyes taking in every detail of the confrontation. 2 security guards blocking a woman's path while other families walked freely past them. The woman's obvious distress, the way she kept looking at the invitation in her hands like it was a lifeline. "I know her," said Petty Officer Williams suddenly, his voice filled with recognition and something else. "Respect. That's the nurse from the Naval Medical Center. She took care of me after Kandahar." The other men turned to look at him, waiting for more explanation. Williams rarely talked about his time in the hospital after the roadside bomb that had nearly cost him his eyesight. They knew he had spent 3 months recovering, but he never discussed the details of those dark days when nobody knew if he would ever see clearly again. "She worked double shifts to stay with me when the doctors weren't sure about my eyes," Williams continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Read to me when I couldn't focus on anything. Brought me books from home on her days off. Never acted like it was part of her job. Just did it because she cared." Sergeant Thompson, standing to Rodriguez's left, squinted at the woman across the lobby. "Wait a minute. I think I know her too. Wasn't she the nurse who stayed with Johnson during that 18-hour surgery after the helicopter crash?" Rodriguez felt a memory stirring in his mind. 3 years ago, after a mission that had gone sideways in the mountains of Afghanistan, his teammate had been brought in with internal bleeding that wouldn't stop. The surgery had lasted through the night, and there had been one nurse who had never left the operating room, never took a break, never showed any sign of giving up even when the doctors started looking worried. "That's her," Rodriguez said quietly. "She saved Johnson's life, worked for 18 straight hours without a break. I remember her because she had paint under her fingernails from painting her kid's bedroom the night before her shift." The men watched as the security guards continued to block Maria's path. Other families flowed around them like water around a stone, some glancing curiously at the scene, but none stopping to help. The woman's shoulders were beginning to slump, in defeat, and Rodriguez could see she was fighting back tears. "This is wrong," muttered Corporal Davis, the youngest member of their group. "She belongs here more than any of us. We're just here because Rodriguez's little brother is graduating. She's here for her own kid." Petty Officer Martinez, who had been silent until now, suddenly stepped forward slightly. "She held my hand during the surgery to remove shrapnel from my chest. I was so scared I couldn't stop shaking, and she just sat there for 2 hours, holding my hand and telling me stories about her son to keep me calm. One by one, more of the SEALs began to recognize the woman who had cared for them during their darkest hours. She had been there when they were at their most vulnerable, when they were scared and homesick and wondering if they would ever be whole again. She had treated them not like patients or cases, but like human beings who needed comfort as much as medical care. She never asked for anything, Williams said, his jaw tightening as he watched the guards continue to humiliate the woman, who had shown him such kindness, never complained about the extra hours, never made us feel like we were bothering her when we needed to talk in the middle of the night. Rodriguez remembered more details now. How she had stayed late to call his mother when he couldn't find the words to explain his injuries. How she had brought homemade soup when he was too nauseous from medication to eat hospital food. How she had listened to him worry about missing his daughter's birthday without making him feel guilty for being upset about something so small compared to what other soldiers were going through. She's got a son, Thompson said suddenly. She used to show us pictures. Kid was maybe 15 or 16 then. Smart kid, she said. Good grades. Wanted to go to college. He paused, putting the pieces together. This is probably his graduation. The lobby was filling with more families now. The ceremony set to begin in 20 minutes. The 10 SEALs watched as the woman's humiliation continued, the guards clearly enjoying their power over someone they saw as beneath them. Other parents walked past in their expensive clothes, talking loudly about their children's achievements and their plans for celebration dinners at restaurants that probably charged more for one meal than this nurse made in a week. I can't watch this anymore, Davis said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. She saved my buddy's life in that field hospital in Iraq, worked for 12 hours straight to stop the bleeding, and now these rent-a-cops are treating her like she doesn't belong here? Rodriguez looked around at his men, seeing the same anger and determination in their faces that he felt in his own chest. These were warriors who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had carried wounded comrades across battlefields, who had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. But right now they were just men who remembered a nurse's kindness during the worst moments of their lives. She never asked us where we came from or what our families did for a living, Martinez said quietly. She just saw soldiers who needed help and she helped us. That's who she is. Petty Officer Anderson, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke up. My mom's a nurse too, works at a hospital in Detroit. She's told me stories about people treating medical staff like they're somehow less important than other people. Like saving lives isn't a real job. The woman at the door was now visibly crying. Though she was trying to hide it from the guards and the other families around her, she kept looking at her invitation, as if staring at it hard enough might somehow change the situation. The guards were unmoved by her tears, their body language making it clear that they had no intention of letting her pass. Enough, Rodriguez said quietly, but with the unmistakable authority of someone who had led men into combat. Form up. Without another word, the 10 Navy SEALs began moving across the lobby with the same quiet precision that had made them legends in the places where America's wars were fought. They moved as one unit, their dress uniforms immaculate, their bearing unmistakably military. Conversations began to quiet as other families noticed them crossing the room. These weren't ordinary men in nice clothes. These were warriors, and everyone in the lobby could sense it. The lobby had been filled with the usual pre-graduation chatter when something shifted in the air. Conversations began to fade as families noticed 10 Navy SEALs moving across the room with purpose. Their dress uniforms were perfect, their steps synchronized, and their faces carried the kind of serious expression that made people step aside without being asked. Maria was still standing at the entrance, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back tears. The security guards were enjoying their moment of power, blocking her path while other families continued to stream past them into the auditorium. She had stopped trying to argue with them, realizing that nothing she could say would change their minds about her worthiness to watch her son graduate. Ma'am, I think it would really be best if you just watched from outside, the older guard was saying, his voice getting louder as if he wanted other people to hear him assert his authority. This is a high-class event, and we need to maintain certain standards. The younger guard nodded in agreement, clearly pleased with his partner's handling of the situation. Maybe you could watch through the window or something. I'm sure your son will understand. Those words hit Maria like a slap. The idea that David would have to explain to his classmates why his mother wasn't there, why she was standing outside like someone who didn't belong, made her stomach turn. She had worked so hard to give him everything she could to make sure he never felt ashamed of where he came from. Now these men were trying to make her the source of his embarrassment. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. Not the casual shuffle of families heading to their seats, but the measured, deliberate steps of people who knew exactly where they were going. She turned around and saw 10 men in navy dress uniforms approaching the entrance. Their faces were serious, their posture military straight, and something in their eyes made the entire lobby fall silent. Commander Rodriguez stepped forward first, positioning himself directly beside Maria. He was tall and imposing, with the kind of presence that came from years of leading men in life-and-death situations. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the now quiet lobby. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said to the security guards, his tone respectful but unmistakably firm. "I believe there might be some confusion here." The guards looked suddenly uncomfortable. The older one tried to maintain his authority, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This is a private matter, sir. We're just doing our job, maintaining security for the graduation ceremony." "I'm sure you are," Rodriguez replied calmly. "But I think you should know who you're talking to." He gestured toward Maria, who was staring at him in confusion, not understanding why these strangers were involving themselves in her situation. Petty Officer Williams stepped up beside his commander, his eyes locked on the guards. "This woman saved my vision when I thought I'd never see again. She worked 18-hour shifts, missed her own meals, and held my hand when I was too scared to sleep." The younger guard shifted nervously, looking around the lobby at all the families who had stopped what they were doing to watch this unexpected scene unfold. "Look, we don't know anything about that. We're just following orders about maintaining appropriate standards for this event." "Appropriate standards?" Sergeant Thompson's voice carried an edge of anger that made several people nearby take a step back. "This nurse has saved more American lives than most people will ever know. She's earned the right to watch her son graduate." More of the SEALs moved forward, forming a semicircle around Maria and the guards. They didn't make any threatening gestures or raise their voices, but their mere presence was enough to command attention. Other families in the lobby began moving closer, drawn by the unusual scene and the obvious importance of what was happening. Petty Officer Martinez looked directly at the older guard and spoke in a voice that carried across the silent lobby. "When I was lying in a hospital bed with shrapnel in my chest, scared I might not make it home, this woman sat with me for hours. She didn't ask if my family had money or what kind of car I drove. She just saw a soldier who needed help." Maria felt tears running down her cheeks, but for the first time that morning they weren't tears of shame. These men were talking about her like she was someone important, someone worthy of respect. She had no idea who they were or why they were helping her, but their words were lifting a weight off her shoulders that she had been carrying for years. The lobby was now completely silent except for the voices of the SEALs as they continued to speak. Families who had been chatting about vacation plans and college preparations were now listening to stories about a nurse who had given everything she had to help wounded warriors heal. "She brought me books from home on her days off," Williams continued, his voice getting stronger. "Read to me when my eyes were too damaged to focus. Never acted like it was charity or pity. Just treated me like a human being who mattered." The school principal, attracted by the commotion, had appeared at the edge of the crowd. She was a middle-aged woman in an expensive suit who looked like she was used to handling difficult situations. But this was clearly something outside her normal experience. Commander Rodriguez turned to address her directly. "Ma'am, I assume you're in charge here. This woman is trying to attend her son's graduation, and your security team seems to think she doesn't meet their standards." The principal looked confused, glancing between the guards and Maria. "I'm sorry. What seems to be the problem? All family members with invitations are welcome at the ceremony." "That's what we've been trying to explain," the older guard said, defensively. But we have concerns about maintaining the appropriate atmosphere for this event. The principal's expression changed as she began to understand what had been happening. She looked at Maria's worn but clean dress, her nervous clutching of the graduation invitation, and the tears still streaming down her face. Then she looked at the 10 Navy SEALs who were clearly prepared to make this a much bigger issue if necessary. There seems to have been a serious misunderstanding, the principal said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with difficult parents and situations for decades. Every family member with an invitation is welcome at this ceremony, regardless of their appearance or background. Corporal Davis, the youngest of the SEALs, stepped forward with the kind of righteous anger that only comes from seeing injustice done to someone who doesn't deserve it. This woman has spent her life taking care of people who protect our country. She's worked double shifts and missed her own son's school events because she was saving lives in a military hospital. And you're going to tell her she can't watch him graduate? The crowd of families that had gathered around them began to murmur among themselves. Some looked ashamed, perhaps realizing they had walked past this woman's humiliation without stopping to help. Others looked angry at the security guards who had created this situation, but all of them were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something important. An older man in an expensive suit pushed through the crowd and approached the group. "Excuse me," he said to Rodriguez. "Did you say this lady works at the Naval Medical Center?" When Rodriguez nodded, the man turned to Maria. "Ma'am, you took care of my nephew 2 years ago after his convoy was hit in Syria. He told us about a nurse who stayed with him through 3 surgeries. Is that you?" Maria nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. More people began stepping forward, sharing their own connections to the military hospital, their own stories of family members who had been cared for by dedicated medical staff who went above and beyond their duties. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. The crowd that had gathered around Maria and the SEALs continued to grow as more families shared their own stories. A woman in an elegant dress stepped forward and said her father had been treated at the Naval Medical Center after a heart attack. A man in a business suit mentioned his brother's recovery from combat injuries. Person after person began to connect the dots between this humble nurse and the lives she had touched. The school principal, clearly embarrassed by her security team's behavior, took immediate action. "Ma'am," she said to Maria, her voice warm and apologetic, "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. Would you please allow me to personally escort you to a front row seat?" Maria wiped her tears and nodded, still overwhelmed by everything that was happening. The 10 SEALs stepped aside to create a path, but they didn't leave. Instead, they formed an honor guard, walking with Maria toward the auditorium entrance. The crowd of families naturally followed, creating a procession that felt more like a celebration than a simple walk to the door. As they entered the auditorium, something magical began to happen. Word of what had occurred in the lobby was spreading, through whispered conversations and text messages. Parents who had already taken their seats were turning to look at the woman being escorted down the aisle by Navy SEALs. Teachers and school staff who had wondered for years why David's mother rarely attended school events were finally understanding the weight of her sacrifices. The principal led Maria to a seat in the very front row, directly in the center where she would have the best view of the stage. "This is where you belong," she said quietly, making sure Maria was comfortable before addressing the security guards who had followed them into the auditorium. "Gentlemen," the principal said in a voice that carried clear authority, "your services are no longer needed here today. Please collect your things and leave the premises immediately." The guards tried to protest, claiming they were just following protocol, but the principal's decision was final. As they left the building, scattered applause broke out from families who had witnessed their behavior in the lobby. The message was clear. This was not how people should be treated, regardless of their appearance or background. The 10 SEALs took seats in the row behind Maria, their dress uniforms creating an impressive backdrop for the woman they had chosen to honor. Other families nearby kept approaching her, some to share their own connections to the military hospital, others simply to thank her for her service to their community. Mrs. Johnson, David's English teacher, appeared at Maria's side with tears in her eyes. "I've taught your son for 2 years," she said. And I've always wondered why such a bright, kind boy seemed to carry so much responsibility on his shoulders. Now I understand. He learned it from watching you." As the ceremony began, the auditorium filled with the usual graduation energy. Students in caps and gowns filed onto the stage. Proud families applauded, and speakers shared messages about achievement and future possibilities. But there was something different in the air today, a sense that something important had happened beyond the usual celebration of academic success. When David's name was called, Maria stood up with pride bursting from every part of her being. But she wasn't alone. The 10 SEALs behind her rose to their feet in perfect unison, standing at attention as her son crossed the stage. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, other families throughout the auditorium began to stand as well. It started with the people who had been in the lobby, who had heard the stories about Maria's dedication and sacrifice. But it spread beyond them, rippling through the entire auditorium as parents and grandparents and siblings rose to honor not just David, but his mother. The applause grew louder and longer than it had for any other graduate, filling the room with a sound that spoke of respect, admiration, and community solidarity. David looked out at the audience and saw his mother in the front row for the first time at any school event. Behind her stood 10 men in military uniforms, and beyond them, hundreds of people were on their feet applauding. He didn't understand exactly what had happened, but he could see the joy and pride on his mother's face, and that was all that mattered. After receiving his diploma, David looked directly at Maria and mouthed the words, "I love you, Mom." She pressed her hand to her heart and mouthed back, "I'm so proud of you." In that moment, all the missed soccer games and school plays didn't matter. All the double shifts and sleepless nights had led to this. Her son graduating with honors, ready to start college in the fall, equipped with the values of hard work and determination she had spent 18 years teaching him. As the ceremony continued, Maria found herself surrounded by new friends. The mother sitting beside her turned out to be a doctor who had heard stories about the incredible nurses at the Naval Medical Center. The father on her other side worked for a company that donated supplies to military hospitals. Everyone seemed to have a connection to her world, connections she had never realized existed. After the formal ceremony ended, families gathered outside for photos and celebrations. David rushed to his mother, still wearing his cap and gown, and swept her up in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "Mom, what happened in there? Why was everyone standing up like that?" Maria looked around at the SEALs who were still nearby, talking with other families and sharing more stories about their experiences at the Naval Medical Center. She thought about trying to explain the morning's events, but decided there would be time for that later. "They were celebrating you," she said simply, "and maybe celebrating all of us who work hard to make good things happen." Commander Rodriguez approached them with a smile. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind, but we'd like to take a photo with you and your son. It's not often we get to thank the people who took care of us when we needed it most." The photo that was taken that day would later appear in the local newspaper, along with a story about a graduation ceremony that became something much more meaningful. It showed David in his cap and gown, beaming with pride, his arm around his mother. Behind them stood 10 Navy SEALs at attention, and in the background, dozens of other families who had stayed to be part of this special moment. But the real story wasn't captured in any photograph. It was the way Maria's life changed that day. Not because of anything material, but because she finally understood her own worth. For 18 years, she had measured her success by her son's achievements and her patient's recoveries. She had never stopped to consider that others might see her as someone worthy of respect and admiration. As families began to leave for their celebration dinners, many stopped to shake Maria's hand or give her a hug. David's classmates approached to thank her for taking care of their relatives. Teachers who had never really noticed her before made sure to tell her how proud they were to have her son in their classes. The 10 SEALs were the last to leave. Williams, the young man whose vision she had helped save, approached her one final time. "Ma'am," he said, "I want you to know that you didn't just help us heal our wounds. You helped us remember what we were fighting for. People like you, families like yours. Thank you for everything, As Maria and David walked to their car, both of them tired but happy, David asked the question that had been on his mind all day. "Mom, do you think things will be different now?" Maria thought about it for a moment, remembering the feeling of standing in that front row surrounded by respect instead of judgment. "I think things have always been exactly what they should be," she said. "We just needed other people to see it too."